Did the Buddha exist? When people get interested in Buddhism, sometimes they ask the question, and it's an understandable question. The Buddha, so we are told, lived a long time ago. Is there any evidence that he ever existed? And of course, people have asked that question about other great men and women from the past also. So, for example, there are some people, I believe, who don't believe that Jesus existed, that he was just a mythological figure. To the best of my knowledge, there is no scholars of Middle Eastern history or Christian history or Bible history who doubt that Jesus lived. It's 99% certain that somebody called Jesus once existed. So what about the Buddha? Well, that question requires a little bit of background. The first is that we really don't know for certain when the Buddha lived. So until fairly recently, most scholars agreed that the Buddha was born in 563 BC and lived for 80 years. Some years ago in Germany, there was a major conference, an international conference, where scholars of Indian history and Indology and Buddhism met together and discussed the issue of the dates of the Buddha. And there was a tacit agreement amongst them that the Buddha may have lived 100 years later than what is generally previously thought. Now, I think it's fair to point out that scholars may come to a different conclusion in the future. For the time being, 563, 483 BC, I think that's certainly roughly around that time. Or you can be less precise and say 5th or 4th century BC, somebody called the Buddha existed. But if we don't know the precise dates that he lived, or even imprecise dates he lived, doesn't that or wouldn't that cast aspersions on whether he did exist or not? Well, there is certain problems. So, for example, in the case of Jesus, there is no material evidence for his existence. So the earliest record we have of Jesus is some of the letters of St. Paul. They date from about 28, 30 years after Jesus. That's the earliest records of him. There are independent records from the great Jewish historian Josephus, about 60 years after Jesus. Nonetheless, that's about as good as you can get. As for material evidence, there really isn't any. But at least there are some written accounts about him dating from 30 to 50, 60 years after he's believed to have lived. In the case of the Buddha, the situation is very different. First of all, it's almost certain that there was no writing in India in the 5th or 4th century BC, and that writing there's no evidence of writing in India until the Mauryan period, when King Asoka had inscribed on great pillars and rocks throughout the Indian subcontinent some of his famous edicts. That's thought to be the oldest decipherable records in India. The second thing is, in a place like the Middle East, Israel, or Palestinian territories, there is quite a lot of material evidence from the time of Jesus. For example, there's an inscription recently found which mentions Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who presided over Jesus' trial. That's pretty good evidence that there was somebody called Jesus who was tried by the Romans. There's nothing like that in India. The climate in the Middle East, the Palestinian territories, is such that it can very easily preserve papyrus, writing material, wooden structures, things like that. The climate in India, northern India, by contrast, definitely, unless it's in metal and stone, it doesn't last very long. Things like written records would not last more than a few years unless they were very carefully preserved. And so we have very, very little material evidence from the time that the Buddha may have lived. So this is a great hindrance to knowing whether he did live, whether he did exist. So that's a bit of a drawback for Buddhism. In the year 249 BC, King Asoka visited the birthplace of Buddha, Lumbini, and he had erected there a large pillar of stone, which you can still see today, and on it he inscribed the fact, he had written that he had visited this place to pay homage to the Buddha. And it has been estimated with a high degree of accuracy that this pillar was erected in the year 249 BC. So that would be maybe 150 years before the Buddha. That's the earliest record outside the Pali Sutras that we have that the Buddha existed. Then in the very end of the 19th century, a stupa, the ruins of a stupa, was excavated in northern India, which we now know was in or near Kapilavastu, the Buddha's homeland. The place is called Piprawa, and inside the stupa was discovered a stone casket which had some writing on it, which is believed to be amongst the earliest writing from India. And it specifically mentions that this casket contained the bodily relics of the Buddha. Now, that's very interesting, because it seems that that casket was placed in that stupa maybe 100, maybe 150, perhaps a little longer, centuries after the Buddha, and it had not been touched since then. It had never been touched from the time it was put in the ground right up until the end of the 19th century. The problem is that dating writing in India is a difficult job, and scholars cannot agree as to how old this writing is. So it's certainly from around the time of the Buddha, but the date of it is uncertain. Then we have some other material. The Maitrayani Upanishad mentions, it gives a warning. It says, or it's a criticism in it, which says, beware of those ascetics who wear yellow robes, who go around with their reason criticizing the Vedas, who teach a doctrine that there is no soul, etc., 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 and are a danger to the Vedic religion. Now, once again, we're unable to say exactly how old this Upanishad is, but it's certainly very, very old. And it implies, it seems to be talking about Buddhist monks. And if there is Buddhist monks, say 200 years after the Buddha, well, that implies that there was a Buddha. So this is about the earliest evidence we have for the Buddha, and it dates from quite some time after him, 150 200, maybe 250 years after him. And like I said, we cannot say for certain because we're not 100% sure when the Buddha did live. So what about the evidence in the Pali Suttas? So the Pali Tripitaka, the sacred scriptures of the early Buddhists, contain numerous dialogues and talks and discussions which are claimed to be the words of the Buddha himself. Traditionally, Theravadan Buddhists have believed that this is a verbatim account of things that the Buddha did and said. Not too many scholars agree with that now. But some scholars say, and I think it's a good argument, that such a large body of philosophical thought couldn't have been, or it seems unlikely that it could have been written by or composed by a committee, which would require, it would be required for somebody to do that, for a group of persons to do that. It seems to suggest that all of this came from a very specific and particular individual. There's a great deal of consistency in all this massive literature. And as I tried to show in my recent book, Footprints in the Dust, that if you go through it and pick out all of the incidents that give some or point to what the Buddha's character, his personality, and his ideas were like, then you do get a rather full and rather convincing and rather consistent idea of a particular individual. Now that I wouldn't call strong evidence, but it is some evidence for the Buddha. Those who disagree with this say that the discourses in the Pali Tripitaka are simply not reliable because they weren't written for several hundred years after the Buddha's passing. This idea, I think, is based on a lack of knowledge. Long before the Buddha, the Brahmins of the Brahminical religion, the Vedic religion, perfected ways of transmitting the Vedic hymns with a high degree of accuracy. I don't want to go into the details, but oral traditions in other cultures were such that it seemed to be that every time the bard chanted or sung the ancient songs, they changed them a little bit each time they did that. That does not seem to be the case with the Vedas. The belief developed that in order to get the gods to answer your prayers, to respond to the hymns that you sung to the gods, the words had to be pronounced absolutely exactly. And they, the Brahmin priests, gradually evolved a system whereby they could remember the exact pronunciation of each word, of each vowel, of each sentence. And we know, it seems to be, that even 1,500 years later, the Vedas still hadn't been committed to writing. There were several reasons for it. One was the Brahmins were very jealous to keep that knowledge to themselves. Another reason was they had no good reason to do it. The techniques that they had evolved were good enough to preserve the spoken word. Now people nowadays tend to think that if something is written, that's it, it's been preserved forever. That is definitely not the case. So today with Xerox machines and what have you, you can write something and then have 10,000 copies of it printed or copied, and it'll be exactly the same. But before printing, everything had to be written by hand. And if you had a very long document, like say the Buddha or the Buddha scriptures, somebody had to write it. And if you can remember the good old days when you wrote letters, you often made mistakes. when scribes were copying out copies of the Bible and some of the Greek tragedies and things like that. They often made mistakes. Sometimes they accidentally missed a whole line. And so if you copied out a text and there were mistakes in it, and the next person wanted a copy of that text, they got your text and they copied it out, and they may have made their own mistakes. And you might have come across the mistakes from the earlier version, and you may have thought, that's obviously a mistake. I better correct it. It probably means this. And you may have misunderstood what the original was. And so as one copy was copied from another, mistakes accumulated over 1,000 years. So sometimes some ancient texts, like the Greek tragedies, the Greek histories and other things, sometimes they're just full of mistakes. It's hard to know sometimes what the original meant. So it is definitely not true to say that simply because something was not committed to writing, that it wasn't authentic. And I think that argument can be made for the Buddhist scriptures. So to sum up, we have what are believed to be quite credible records of what the Buddha said and did in the Pali Tipitaka. We have one inscription by King Asoka dating from about 150, nearly 200 years after the Buddha. We have the Piprawa vase with its inscription on it, which dates from some centuries after the Buddha. And we have one of the Upanishads, which seems to mention the existence of somebody called the Buddha, or somebody dubbed the Buddha. That is not as much evidence as we have, say, for Jesus or some other characters from history, but it's the best we have. And that's about all that can be said on the subject.